Even if the perfectly walkable existed, actually there are things that we need to fix first. People can agree that we did not really solve problem by adding lanes.
Dr. Tamara Bozovic, civil engineer, transport analyst, walkability expert.
In Auckland, for instance, a quarter of the trips that people drive are under 1 kilometer and 14% are even under 500 meters. We don't have a good understanding of why people drive short trips and why people don't walk short trips.
The city's main arterial routes gridlocked.
Is a congestion tax right for Auckland? Lots of you are saying yes.
Maybe the solution isn't we need more drivers so there are more buses on the route. If you can convince half of those people to walk, then you don't have a bus driver problem to fix.
We built all this infrastructure with the idea of enabling us to access places. It had some pretty bad consequences that we are not really aware of.
Walkability. How do we properly gauge whether walking somewhere is viable or not? Every unique journey in daily life presents a variety of potential transport options to us. But we need to stop thinking of this as car versus bus versus biking versus walking. All these modes kind of coexist together, or at least they should, to allow for the unpredictability of everyday human behaviour and the hundreds of factors that impact how we get around. Can you actually improve the tangible walkability of a city? Let's take a walk with Dr. Tamara Bozovic and find out. This is PhD Unpacked.
Before we get into your research, can you first tell us a little bit about your personal background, your professional background, and I guess how you ended up writing this PhD specifically?
Yeah, I'm a transport engineer. Technically, I'm a civil engineer, but I really, during my studies, it was the early 2000s, and I was really interested by the climate change and the idea that we need to, really this urgency of doing something. And transport seemed a way of, okay, this is a topic where there's a lot to do, and I oriented my studies towards transport engineering. And my whole professional life, I always picked jobs that looked at alternatives to driving. So I worked, and it was about active travel, but also public transport, and worked a lot with urban designers, so got to understand better these connections between transport and land use. So really come from this professional background of transport engineering, and as you said, I worked in Switzerland, I worked in Argentina, I worked in Aotearoa as well, and I was really always interested in how do we change, how do we make change happen for transport to be more sustainable, but also more equitable? And that's something that maybe came I educated myself maybe a bit later about the inequities in transport, and seeing that as such an important topic and such an urgent thing that we need to make happen.
It feels like there's these two different elements to your research and I guess your professional background that come together in this PhD, and the one pocket being climate change and the other being social justice.
Yeah.
And you speak about in your research, I guess, social justice, looking at barriers that stop people from accessing things, and I guess walking being our most basic way of getting around is potentially something that people don't think about being something that can be discriminatory. When did you first have that thought that walking might be something like a core focus to do in terms of your PhD research, rather than I mean, I know it ties into driving and transport. This is all one conversation, but did you have a kind of light bulb moment where you thought, wow, walking is something that we don't research enough?
Yeah, first I was interested in walking as part of zero carbon modes, and as you said, really the most basic way of getting around. Living in Switzerland, it was not such a big topic. Switzerland is very tidy and pretty accessible. I must say, coming to New Zealand, things changed. First Argentina and then New Zealand, things changed a bit, thinking about especially how traffic-related infrastructure impacts on, to start with my own experience of walking, and how some places can be pretty hostile to walking. And then working in this field and realizing that as transport engineers, we don't have such a good knowledge of things that people might be struggling with. We don't have it mapped, say, where are the places that people cannot access, where they cannot cross the road. Talking with disabled people is also different light bulb moments, because I think as non-disabled people, there are just a lot of things that we just don't even see because they don't matter. And then when you talk with someone who is really impacted by those things that you don't see, it really questioned me as transport engineer, thinking, wow, I didn't know that. And that's really pretty major. And I started reading about severance, and severance is this idea of people not being able to access their destinations. And often severance, or almost always severance, happens because of transport infrastructure. So it's a road that we built to connect A to B. But actually going across that road can be really hard and can cut people from things that might be on the other side. And that's something that I found really interesting, this idea that we built all this infrastructure with the idea of enabling us to access places, and how it had some pretty bad consequences that we are not really aware of.
And I guess on that point, when we think about walkability, it's probably something that if you spoke to 100 people in a street and you said, do you think it's important for people to walk more? People would be, of course, immediately climate change. We want to encourage people to be getting out of car. The entry level to this topic, most people are probably on board with. It's the diving into what's not as simple as just saying people should walk more.
Yeah.
It's far more complex of a discussion than people potentially often give it credit for.
It is, and I also think it's really not a behavior change thing. I know that we are human. We are going to do what is convenient, what feels good, what is pleasant, what is doable in the first place. So I'm not interested in changing people, and I don't believe that we are going to change the nature of human beings. I don't think that's a very good goal to work towards, but I think that our environment can or does enable or disable some things, or make some things easy and convenient, and make some things a bit of a pain. So I think I'm really interested in how we change the environment so that the environment encourages those behaviors that we want to see happen.
Lots of your research applies to any sort of metropolitan city, and obviously there are takeaways that you can apply to any particular city. We're recording this in Wellington. There's many elements of your research that we can apply to a Wellington context. But I guess it's worth asking, what makes Auckland a good case study for this research in particular?
Yeah, well, I had this idea of the traffic-related infrastructure on my mind starting the PhD. And I think Auckland is, unfortunately, quite a good, quote-unquote, example of a city that was really built around motorized traffic. So Auckland was massively developed in the 20th century, between the 1920s and the 1960s, 70s onwards. Most of the development happened in this modernist era where we saw car as an element of progress. A lot of Auckland has been really developed with massive infrastructure for traffic. Jan Gale, who is a bit of a star urbanist, called Auckland a peak hour traffic machine. And I find it interesting. So Auckland went a very long way in providing attractiveness for driving, which actually doesn't even work, because driving in Auckland can be really, well, I think people can agree that we did not really solve problem by adding lanes. So it's a good example because it's very car centric, and so it's a good place to study how this infrastructure built for traffic, what it does to people who try to walk or who would like to walk.
And also, I guess one point that you make in your description of Auckland is it's not just that the infrastructure of the city is car centric. It's also that there appears to be a disconnect, and this is your words, between policy objectives relative to walkability, understanding of users' needs, and delivery of more walkable environments. So it's one thing to say that a city, is car heavy, but also potentially the people who have the ability to make change to perhaps make it more walkable don't actually understand what is
yeah.
happening with the city.
When I was first investigating New Zealand, because I got appointed at Waka Kotahi, and I was investigating the strategies and planning, etc., and I got quite excited because strategies say the right words. and I think there is this disconnect that you say between strategies that say all the things that you want to read, that we are going to have a system that is carbon neutral, that people are going to choose to walk and cycle and take the public transport, and that things are going to be accessible. And then it's really how do you get from there to the practice. So yeah, thank you for bringing this point. And that was really the last study, was really engaging with professionals about, okay, how do we loop this loop? How do we, because at the end of the day, the purpose of this research was always bring something back to the practice, because I'm interested in how we improve the streets. I'm not interested in doing research for the sake of research.
Could you give us, I guess, like an overhead description of some of the elements of that model? I realize that it's a visual tool and this is an oral medium, but some of the stuff that goes into this, like what makes a city walkable?
Totally. Happy to explain. Before that, I would just like to mention that the idea of walkability is not consensual. So there is not an agreement, even within academia or within professionals. We speak of cities that are walkable, and we can be talking about different things. So that was actually the first literature review was part of one of the questions is really, what do we mean by walkability? And actually we mean all kinds of different things, and there is no agreement. There are some scores, like walk scores, offered to measure or quantify walkability, but they can mean very different things from they, for instance, don't look at the quality of the walking environment. So the model that I found very helpful was first developed by Isabella Alfonso, and it links the environment to people's behaviors, but it says two important things. The first important thing is that this link is not direct. The link between environment and behavior is not direct. The link goes through people's perceptions. So the objective environment, things that you can measure, things that you can observe, the person is going to act on them only once they have processed them in their brain and once they have made their opinion of their environment. And so I found useful that Isabella Alfonso put this people's perceptions in a hierarchy like Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, except in this case it's a hierarchy of walking needs. So from the most basic being feasibility to more sophisticated like pleasantness. So person is exposed to an environment, say a street or a crossing, and they are going to decide, well, in the first place, is this thing feasible? And if this thing is not feasible, well, they're not even going to consider things higher up in the hierarchy because they don't matter.
Say a street is completely flooded from the rain and it's needing water because it's been designed poorly. Someone's not going to go wading through that thing.
So that could totally be that could totally be a thing. And the other important thing is that this connection between environment, people's perceptions and behaviors, what influences it is people's individual characteristics, the characteristics of their travel. An example would be a stretch of street that has a lot of traffic, that is grey, and maybe if you're choosing to go for a walk, you might not choose to go there for a walk because it just doesn't feel as a place that you would choose. But maybe the same street is on your shortest path to your bus stop that you need to take to go to work. Well, in this case, you're going to your motivations are going to be different, and so you're going to take this the street that you, even though you perceive it as maybe uncomfortable or unpleasant. So that's the basic model, and so this is still in development, and there are things that are, as you said, there are things that are open for debate, and that's something that I'm actually having a debate on with people in the academia and the practice right now. But I do find really helpful this idea of disentangling the objective environment that we measure and people's perceptions, and also saying, well, actually people's perceptions matter. It's not only the things that we measure and that we consider important. It's really important to understand, and in my case what interested me is to understand what is it that people might struggle with, or for which people might say, I'm just not going to do this.
Yeah, because there's two sides to this sort of situation, right? One is why do people choose to walk somewhere, and the flip side is what are direct barriers that prevent people from that. And in that first pool of questions of what makes something walkable, what is the experience of people that would make them choose to walk somewhere. I love that example of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because often visualized in this sort of pyramid form, it makes it really clear the things that at the base level, say safety being a big thing for walking, it is something that if something feels unsafe, it is going to be the first thing that decides whether someone walks somewhere or not. But the higher end needs might be, as you say, pleasure. Like if something is really beautiful and is a great experience. For example, thinking of Wellington, people walking around the waterfront, walks that take you through the botanical gardens. That is near the sort of the pointy end of the pyramid, the kind of beauty of walking space. And I think it's really worth saying that within your PhD, one of the studies did ask people why they chose to walk in places, and you found that lots of the responses were to do with experience.
Yeah, and I think the factors are going to be different for what you choose to do or what you decide not to do. And I really think there are some elements that are just your basic needs, and feasibility or safety or accessibility are probably parts of your basic needs. You're not going to choose. It's not a very aspirational thing to say, oh, this is safe. So, I mean, yeah, it is. And it's not something that is going to make you choose a thing. However, you really need it as a basic ingredient of your decision. Yeah.
When you put it into words, it seems to me quite common sense. But what you found is that there is not a whole lot of agreement on what within people in the professional environments that have impact on let's say city planning, urban designers, health, transport. Lots of them don't agree, as you said before, on what walkability is. For some people, walkability is not about experience, it's more about the physical possibility of reaching a destination, which I would have thought, well, of course, people must be taking into account experience, but that is actually doing too much presuming, right?
Yeah, it is. And I think it's one of the probably bad leftovers from the glorious 50s and 60s where engineers knew the things and there was a lot of this techno-rationalism where we know what people need, and we're going to build it, and they're going to come. And Jane Jacobs, actually from the 60s, I think Jane Jacobs is famous still now because in the 60s she dared oppose this idea, because she lived in New York, and Greenwich Village was going to be destroyed to build a motorway, and she organized the neighborhood to resist this, saying, no, you engineers think that the motorway needs to go there because you think that we need this speed, and you think that people need to travel, but actually people live here, very, very diverse people. And she observed how the life of the neighborhood and the fact that it's just incompatible with a motorway, and she observed how again, engineers would build those residential areas that were actually quite sterile and where there wasn't this kind of life on the street as in Greenwich Village where she was living. And so she was one of the first figures who just stood up and said, no, we can't, this is not progress. And honestly, in engineering school, I would have loved to learn more about psychology, anthropology, sociology. There is just not much of that. There is really this idea of a lot of assumptions of what people need. And walkability indices, WalkScore, for instance, looks at the destinations you have around you and assumes how long you are going to be willing to destinations, and assumes what kind of destinations you are going to need, and then calculates and says, in this area you have your cafes, restaurants, shops, etc. within 1.5 to 2 kilometers, and therefore you're going to be happy. And it just does not reflect the experience of there's a lot of assumptions. For instance, just the basic thing of how long how much you're willing to walk or what places you want to access. And other indices take into account the street connectivity and the density and the land use. But again, it's proxies. They don't take into account the street environment and also not people's experiences.
I live in a suburb called Hataitai, and Hataitai is connected to the Wellington CBD by probably a 25-minute walk. And one of those walks takes you over Mount Victoria, and you might argue is the more sort of beautiful nature walk, but takes slightly longer. And the shorter version is through the Mount Vic Tunnel. And I'm sure that there would be some people who would look at that walk and say, well, you can get quite directly from Hataitai into town in 25 minutes, but that walk through the tunnel is so unpleasant because it's, for one thing, the air quality feels terrible. It's really, really loud, because this particular tunnel has a history of motorists tooting because of a ghost story, but it's so loud when you're walking in there, even if you have headphones on, and so you would look at that walk and think, it gets me from point A to point B quite efficiently and connects the suburb I live in a walking way to town. But there are days where I just think, is that something that I want to do?
And it's such a good also example of the trade-offs that people keep making. And what I've seen in interviews is typically trade-offs between safety and convenience. And it can be where I'm going to choose to cross the road, and maybe it's convenient, and maybe I'm just going to just dash across the road because it's not very safe. And then you talk with disabled people who just don't have that choice and who are just going to go the long way because it's the only way possible.
And another thing, I guess, when we think about the way that professionals in these different fields think about walking and walkability and the quality of walking is, you mentioned that even when they agree, like for example, if a public health specialist and a transport planner might agree that safety is important, but they might be coming at it from completely different angles. And the example you give is, public health specialists might have reference to a general feeling of health and safety, whereas a transport planner might be thinking of it as crossings and how that relates to where pedestrians are. And they're both thinking about pedestrians not being threatened by traffic, but where they're coming from a specialized perspective is actually thinking about two different things.
You're right. And also in transport, I think we still unfortunately tend to look at safety in terms of crashes, and we tend to look at places where people died. Herman Knoflacher said this sentence that I thought was pretty amazing. He said, you don't justify a bridge by counting people who swim, and apply to transport, meaning there are places that are just feel so unsafe that people are not going to even try to cross there, and therefore no one is going to be hit there or die, and therefore in transport statistics, and when we look at places, if we improve based on where crashes happen, this place is not going to register because there will be nothing to see. And I think that's something that we really need to get away from, this idea of just reacting to crashes, which can really happen based on, they cannot happen because people are not there. They can happen for really
any number of
bad
reasons.
luck or any number of reasons, but we don't look at the notion of risk, and really we need to look at how dangerous a place is and how many people are exposed to this danger. And that's something that we don't have, and I think maybe health professionals have a better understanding of safety in terms of public health risk, but also look at a holistic way and look at people's experience of safety, which is not something that we focus a lot on in transport engineering.
So, Tamara, to bring this back to the specific research within your PhD, which encompasses a few different studies, I wanted to ask you about the first study that you endeavoured to go about to find out some elements about walkability. And it was a survey study, to quote from your research, identifying associations between people's perceptions of their walking environment and walking levels, considering individual characteristics and the use of public transport. Can you tell us a little bit about that survey, what you were kind of trying to discover at that point in the research, and I guess ultimately some of the things that the findings presented to you?
Yeah, it was really a bit of an opportunity. So at that point, I identified the theoretical model that says environment, perceptions, behaviors, and individual characteristic influencing all of that. And the survey was an opportunity, so it's Auckland Transport Active Mode survey, and they asked over 4,000 people. Well, at that point I had over 4,000 responses, and for each person they ask quite a range of questions, and they ask people about their attitudes to walking. They ask people about their perceptions of their environment, such as my destinations are in walkable distance, or walking feels safe, etc. They ask some basic demographic questions, age, for instance, and they ask the travel behavior in the previous week. It was great for me to have this data set that has people's perceptions of their environment and people's behaviors and some individual characteristics. And I thought, okay, let's try to see what are the connections between both. So the difficulty was that it's a huge data set, so huge in terms of number of people, but that's not a problem in terms of analysis. The problem of analysis is the number of variables. And in this case, I had over 40 variables that were potentially interesting, such as people's attitudes. For instance, I walk because it's fun, I walk for fitness, etc., and people's perceptions of their environment. And so that was another kind of opportunity, but also thing I was curious about is to test machine learning, because unlike classical statistical methods where we're going to take two variables and look at what extent they are associated, machine learning is very different. So in this case, I could cram everything in the model. So I took the walking behavior as my outcome, and I asked two questions. First is, can we predict if someone is going to walk little or much based on what they said in terms of how they see their environment, their attitude to walking, and their characteristics? Turn out it's not perfect, but there is some predictive power. And the second question was, then what matters? So it was an iterative model that modeled people's behaviors based on their choices. So my first goal was really to this link between perception and behavior. And I think part of me was hoping that people who find their walking environment pleasant and accessible, etc., are going to be the ones who walk much, and those who don't are the ones who walk little. And actually that was not what I found, but that's the joy of science, right? You start with the assumption and then maybe you find something else. And in this case, the number one predictor of if someone is going to walk much or little was the use of public transport, which, when you think about it, is really not a surprise. And it's something that we know, that walking is part of most, if not all, public transport trips. Yet, for instance, in those walkability indices, public transport doesn't score. They look at the end destinations, but not at walk to public transport. So that was the first interesting thing, was, okay, well, yeah, public transport actually has a huge importance even in a place like Auckland. And the other was the importance of all those variables where people implicitly compare walking to other modes. So walking is cheaper, or walking saves me parking hassle, or walking is faster. Or those who drive, they don't walk when walking is not fun. So that was also the other interesting thing, to say, well, you can't, and again, it's nothing new in itself. It's something that we know. Yet I think that there is a bit, in both in research and in practice, this tendency to focus on the walking environment, say, the footpath, we're going to fix the footpath. And I think the outcome of the study is, actually it doesn't matter if driving is really convenient. You can fix this footpath all you want. Maybe the person is not even going to notice it because driving is convenient and they are driving. So that was the for me the interesting thing, to put walking one, to connect it with public transport, and two, to put it within the broader transport system. So I developed throughout the project, the PhD, I developed this model, and in the end I broke it, so to say, because I really there is one piece of research that says that modal choice is the result of the messiness of everyday life, and I do think we are human, we are complex. It's really we cannot expect to predict someone's behaviors. Maybe it rains, maybe you have you've bought a new microwave and you don't want to carry it, or a whole range, or I don't know, you have your child with you and it's just too complicated. So I abandoned the idea of predicting someone's choice, but I use it as a model of non-walkability, saying, well, I'm not really interested in predicting someone's choice, but I'm really interested in better understanding what are those things that are deal breakers. And I think that for me as a transport professional, I need to be able to say what the deal breakers are, and I think that the transport profession needs to fix the deal breakers. And then messiness of everyday life will happen, people will be people, they will make choices, but I think our responsibility is to remove those things that just make choices impossible.
Which I think is a really fascinating mindset shift, but it's more about how can you remove as many things as possible that will guarantee or make it very likely that someone will choose not to walk somewhere. People are so diverse, you're never going to be able to make everyone the same, and therefore they will fit the platform of walking. But what you can identify is what are the things that are definitely stopping people from walking, and this very helpfully takes us into the element of your PhD, which is about barriers to walking. And could you talk us through, I guess, some of the later studies that were more focused on this idea of barriers, and what did you find about the kind of concrete pillars? I guess they could be literal concrete pillars or metaphorical concrete pillars that make people choose to not walk somewhere, and the diversity of experience that interacts with.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, that was a bit of a light bulb moment, thinking, well, I don't think that the perfectly walkable exists. Yeah. Because even for you, if you were to think of what's perfectly walkable, maybe what's perfectly walkable today would not be the exact same as tomorrow. And I also thought, well, given where we are here in a very car-centric environment, even if the perfectly walkable existed, actually there are things that we need to fix first. So that's why I was interested in barriers. It's really what are those deal breakers. So I talked with 56 people, half of whom had at least some difficulty with walking, hearing, seeing, or remembering and concentrating. And those are the people that I grouped as disabled people, but I would just like to put out there that I do think that, well, we know that disabled people are not a homogeneous group, they are very diverse, but I just wanted to have the experience of people who have some difficulties with either motor or sensory difficulties. So I interviewed them, and I was really interested in the things that they might struggle with. So we talked about walks that they usually walk, and I asked what are the things that they enjoy, but also what are the things that they might find difficult. I was really interested in them telling me exactly what it was and why it was difficult, but I was also interested in putting it on a map so that then after interviewing them, I could go to that place and see what is it, because I'm interested in comparing people's experience of saying something is difficult and the objective aspect of, okay, what is on the ground? What is this that makes this person think it is difficult? So that was one thing, was ask people what is difficult in the walks they make. And the other thing that I was really interested in is asking them about places that they consider as being within walkable distance and where they would like to go, but where they don't go, and ask why that is. And that's something that, again, we don't know enough about. In Auckland, for instance, a quarter of the trips that people drive are under 1 kilometer, and 14% are even under 500 meters. So people drive short trips. but we don't have a good understanding of why people drive short trips and why people don't walk short trips. So I was really interested, and that's the idea of severance, the idea of there is this place I would like to go to, and I can't. So I asked people to name the places that they would like to access, and again to understand what makes them say they don't want to. They want to walk. I think what came really strongly out of this is the idea of traffic and traffic-related infrastructure. So the number one thing people talked about is difficulty of crossing the road, and non-signalized crossings came a lot. So as in a lot of towns and cities in New Zealand, there are a lot of non-signalized crossings where we transport engineers, we might have dropped curbs, but you maybe as a driver, you might not even know that this is a crossing because nothing tells you that this is a crossing. And these places came a lot. And the interesting thing was that traffic and traffic-related infrastructure came both from disabled and non-disabled people. So that's the first interesting finding. Like, everyone struggles with the same things. The difference was that these things had quite different consequences and significances. For disabled people, it could be a no-go. I just cannot cross there. For non-disabled people, it would be just like, it's annoying and it's unsafe and I don't want to be here. And it was a bit of an eye-opener in something that I had already heard before from disabled people, but that is not known well enough from in transport engineering, is that some staples of transport engineering are just not accessible to some people. For instance, for blind people, when you have a non-signalized crossing with a pedestrian refuge in the middle of the road, A, they don't know that there is a refuge in the middle of the road. B, they cross by hearing a gap in the traffic. And if the traffic is high enough, they cannot hear the gap. Maybe there is a gap from this side and you would cross and you would stand in the middle. They can't, because they can't hear that there is a gap in this side, and also they don't know that there is a refuge. So they were telling me, well, these things are just not useful for me. And one of my participants needs to take the bus, he's blind, needs to take the bus to go to work. And there is this one crossing where some days he waits for 10 minutes because he needs to wait long enough to hear the gap in the traffic. And he was telling me his wife could drive him to work, but he finds it really important that he would be able to go to work by himself. So this for me was really interesting, to hear from people what are the things that they struggle with, and then to be able to go and see how those things look like. And so, for instance, people talked about non-signalized crossings, and I really wanted to give something specific to transport engineers. Because if I tell a transport engineer non-signalized crossings are difficult, I can understand their difficulty. They are going to say, well, we have zillions of them. Which ones are difficult? So I really wanted to be more specific about the ones that are difficult. And that was quite a good surprise or finding, to say, well, actually we can characterize those places in quite an objective way. So in this case, I found that three things mattered. Often in transport engineering, we look at the number of vehicles or traffic, but actually that was one of the elements. The other was how open the corner was. So say if you're going to cross a side road and you have a lot of traffic on the main road, maybe you don't have a lot of traffic on the side road, but any traffic driving fast on the side road could turn left, and you know that actually this being very open, they would be at you very fast. So that was important, just the geometry of the crossing. And the other was the complexity, how many movements you need to keep an eye on before you decide to cross. And those things are pretty simple. So it was possible to put numbers on. With the radius higher than X and with the complexity higher than X, you need to expect people to struggle with those places. And that for me was really interesting, because I think that could allow us to scan cities. If we find this important, if we find important that people struggle to cross the streets, we can scan with this information, we can scan our cities, and we can identify all the places where these people might be in difficulty. And the other interesting thing for me was to reality check our design guidelines. I said, okay, I found those parameters that people struggle with. Do the design guidelines tell us to avoid those parameters or to design them better? And that was the finding was that the guidelines are a bit misaligned. There are things that people struggle with that the guidelines don't have on the radar. And then again, for me as a professional, that's interesting, saying, well, maybe this is a scope for updating our guidelines and having guidelines that make us first build things that are going to be accessible, but also allow us to spot those places that people are currently struggling with or might be struggling with.
And I guess that's the disconnect between someone who, say, and this is such a generic image to paint, but person X who's a city planner sitting in an office who's never walked the street that they are deciding how to design, right? Versus the person who actually lives on that street and knows the complexities of what that experience is. And I thought it was fascinating in one of your studies that you engaged in this thing called citizen science, where, to summarize sort of quite quickly and crudely, you basically, you said, who wants to help with the study? You did some level of training and you kind of sent them out there into the street to say, walk the streets, tell us what what problems are presented to you. And in the PhD, you can see certain photos of low-hanging trees and curbs that are buckled and some of the examples that you've mentioned, which I thought was such a true-to-life summary of what walkability is, to actually say, go out there and tell us what the problems are that may not show up on, not that I'm a city planner of any kind, but I imagine there are reports with numbers and graphs that don't pick up on what that lived experience is.
Yeah, totally. And even you, you have a lot of good city planners and transport planners who will go there and who will see the place, but people are very different, and in my case, for instance, every time I walk the street with a blind participant, I learn something new, and I really think that as transport engineers, we are not trained enough to be attuned to the diverse needs of diverse people. So that was interesting to, and those people were participants from my interview. So some participants wanted to continue the study, and there was a app that is quite easy to use, that they could use whenever they wanted. Whenever they wanted to go on a walk, they could use the app, and they could stop at a place that they find interesting, take a photo, and then you have a smiley face, and you can put you can add some detail about. You can put either a voice message or type why this place is either beneficial or a difficulty. The most interesting results came from my blind participants. It was also an interesting test because the app was designed to enable diverse people to participate, but actually it was not very accessible to blind people, which in itself I thought was an interesting finding. I think that we need to work more with blind people, and we need to make tools accessible to them. So actually one of the findings of the study was really, or one of the recommendations was how to improve those kind of tools to be more accessible to everyone. And the other was, really, as you said, this like true to life. Okay, they really spoke about the accumulation of micro, quote unquote, barriers. That's also like a bit of a reality check for research, or that when you do research, the way you design it is going to influence the results. So in my case, when I design interviews, I talked about routes that people will typically walk, and so we focused only on those routes, and we focused on those places that people remember, and so they are going to be pretty big things. But then when they walk on the street, they might notice those small things, and they might tell me about that. So that was actually really interesting and important to find this, how the granularity of results depends on the methods. Yeah.
The chapter 7 of your PhD, which is where you spoke to people, professionals from different backgrounds who've been planning health transport, and asked them a number of questions. And the question you asked them about how facilitators of and barriers to walking described, a key finding was just about a lack of quality data.
I think there are layers of complexity to that.
Yeah.
So the naive engineer in me would like to think that better data will make us take better decisions. I think the reality is that that's not how it happens. And so in the study, I surveyed people, and so it was an anonymous survey of people from different disciplines. And then I had a focus group with professionals from different disciplines. And in this focus group was actually extremely interesting because we talked about two things. We talked about the lack of focus on user experiences, and we talked about the challenge of making cities more walkable. And in the discussion, what came out is that these two things are linked, and we found a vicious circle that goes from decision making through to how we collect data, who we engage with or not, how we visualize the difficulties people might have or not, where we put investment. And I think professionals, there are things that they know or don't know, but the core difficulty for me is decision making. So in strategies, we speak about cities being accessible, so implicitly we speak about people's experiences, we speak about the fact that people are going to find this place navigable or pleasant or livable. But that's not how we allocate money. Money is allocated based on benefit-cost ratios, and those are calculated based on time savings, most often for drivers. For traffic, you might have seen those maps where the map is yellow or orange or green, depending on if traffic is progressing fast or is jammed. There is nothing such for walkability. We don't have such an overview of, those are the places that we should be focusing on, because we don't collect the data, because we are not required to collect the data, and even if we did, we wouldn't act directly upon it. So that was actually really interesting for me, this whole discussion, and that's where one of the participants said we treat people like tiny cars. Even if the framework allows us to account for pedestrians' time savings or time losses, and we could calculate, say, the amount of dollars wasted because people wait too much time. If you don't know how many people cross at a certain place or how many people would want to cross and don't, you're not going to have this dollar value to put against at all.
If we can at least make it clear that walking and walkability is not a homogenous thing, it is a diverse experience, is that kind of the starting point to then potentially make sense of more of the complexities? And, you know, as you've just mentioned, you know, it's not as simple as saying, here are the barriers, fix them. But maybe that is where I think the entry point is.
I think the entry point is really what we want walking and walkability to be. So for me, the entry point would be for policy and governance to be serious about walking and to say, we want this much walking to happen. And like, I often think of JFK's moon talk. We want to go to the moon, right? We're going to hire the scientists, we're going to figure it out, we're going to make it happen. So I think that the base difficulty is that there is not really this very ambitious, strong will of, we are going to unlock walking and we are going to make a drastic change in how cities function. I think if we had this, that would really be a strong mandate for, in the first place, better understanding how walking works. And the difficulty is that we don't have the agreement on what matters for walking, and so we might assume that people just want the shortest route, or people just want to go from A to B. I think that there are really ways forward. It's really having the mandate and then being serious about having the right indicators and acting upon them. I would really like to see prioritized list of actions saying, we scanned Auckland, these are the top 10 deal breakers and we're going to fix them in the next 6 months. And then there are those following 10 deal breakers and the next 10 and the next 10. But there is not that. Works are done, left, right and center, but there is not this accountability saying, we are going to put the money and the effort in the places that are going to make the biggest difference.
And as we've spoken about earlier, it's being cognizant of the fact that we're trying to improve walkability, but we can't have the tunnel vision of just walking. It must be considered in relation to public transport
absolutely.
and to driving. I mean, e-scooters are a huge thing now that 10 years ago wouldn't have been part of the equation, but are absolutely part of an equation now. It all exists in the same environment of when people need to or want to get from somewhere to another place. Looking at the complexities of how that exists, and of course that is different in every single city. How it manifests and exists in Auckland is completely different from Wellington, is completely different from London, is completely different from Buenos Aires. You have to, obviously within the specific environment of local council or government, it's not enough to just think, how can we make something more walkable? It's how does it exist with the number 2 bus and how often that's running and everything else going on.
It's such a great point. And yes, I think we really need to make, at the end of the day, streets for people. And there is really this huge effort of retrofitting all this infrastructure that we've inherited, and that was, in the case of New Zealand, much of what we see around us was designed in the 20s, 30s, 40s, built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and it's still, like, we wouldn't use a phone from the 50s, but we consider that a street that was designed in the 50s is still good for purpose. So there is this really broader picture of retrofitting environments, and I think it also doesn't help that our budgets are split by mode. We have a tiny budget for walking, and then budget for budget for walking is often together with cycling, so then that's another problem. We really should have budgets for making streets more amenable places, and in a street that is more human friendly, you can't really say, the 2% of the works were for walking. Everything was for walking if the street becomes more human friendly. But the way our policy and budgets are set up doesn't necessarily help towards this. I really think that public transport operators and providers should really be interested in walkability, because it's not enough to have X amount of people living around your bus stop. If they struggle to get to your bus stop, odds are they might not.
We know in Wellington and New Zealand generally there's a bus driver shortage, and the amount of times you go to a bus stop and you can't get on the bus because it's packed and they go past, and a lot of the frustration at the moment in the city planning is we need more bus drivers so we can have more buses on the route so people can use them. But maybe the solution isn't we need more drivers so there are more buses on the route. If you can convince half of those people to walk, then you don't have a bus driver problem to fix.
And I think those two things are going parallel. So walking needs to be more convenient and pleasant for some, and on the other hand, we need to accept that bus is going to be extremely useful for either some people or for you when you buy your microwave or
when it rains, it rains.
When it rains, yeah, absolutely. And the third thing is that if your buses are stuck in traffic, you're going to need exponentially more drivers who are going to be stuck in traffic with your buses, as opposed to providing infrastructure that is going to prioritize buses, where you're going to have fewer vehicles and drivers doing the job that you need and ensuring the frequency that you want on, say, certain routes. So it's really connected, and I really think, as you were saying, it's having this holistic approach, improving walking, but at the same time we need to decrease the attractiveness of driving. We need to acknowledge that we've gone too far and that we are in a climate crisis, and that driving not only is a major danger in terms of climate, but also in terms of road safety, in terms of public health, in terms of urban sprawl that we don't talk enough about. So there needs to be this. We need to be backtracking. We need to be transforming our streets to be more amenable for humans and not vehicles.
And there's something that you say in the PhD which I think is a really interesting provocation to kind of finish on. You write about the environment must adapt to the people, not the other way around, which when I first read it I thought that seems so against the way that we think about problem solving and the diversity of people and individual experience and people's ability to change. But the more I read that, the more I thought this absolutely makes sense, that people are stubborn. Some people, there will always be change, and if you present opportunities and reasons why people should change, they will. But it's easier to fix an environment, and then people may make their decisions after that, rather than, within this greater climate change conversation. It's not as simple as saying to people, hey, if everyone changes, things will radically become different. There are very specific, tangible things in the environment that can be adapted, and maybe we need to change our position from what can we do to change people, and more what can we do to change the environment that they navigate in daily life.
Totally. I would like to take a completely disconnected example or analogy for this.
Please do.
Branded with a fruit that makes smartphones. They didn't make a smartphone that is like this dysfunctional brick saying, here's this dysfunctional brick, use it or die. No, they are really interested in what people find convenient and useful and helpful, because that's what people are going to choose. So they are really putting a lot of time and money and energy into understanding and having all those they invented the term user experience. Like, they are really interested in user experience because that's how people are going to choose their products. And I would also just like to briefly link to the social model of disability, because I think I think it really talks to the same idea. The social model of disability says disability is not a characteristic inherent to the person. The disability is the characteristic of the interaction of the person and their environment. And an environment can enable a person to do things or can disable them from doing things. So if you don't have a leg, that's not a problem in itself. The problem is if the environment around you does not allow you to navigate. And so you spoke of people making choices and sometimes being stubborn. There are some people who have real difficulties and for whom the environment can make things just plain impossible. And I think that's a moral responsibility and duty to understand this and to fix it.
I love that. Before we finish off, is there anything else that you want to touch on? I mean, it's been a few years since the PhD was published. Obviously, you live in Bristol now. You've returned to New Zealand exclusively for this interview. Have spent some time in Auckland. I guess to wrap things up, is there anything that you haven't spoke about that you'd want to touch on, or how you think about what you're doing now or the future, whether it be for Auckland or the work you do? Just kind of an open mic if there's anything that you wanted to discuss before we finish.
Oh, that's dangerous to open the mic for people who've done a PhD. Well, we tend to be like really passionate about what we've done. No, but I would just like to talk about a small thing. Small, not small. Until now, I was really focused on the technical aspects of what should we fix, and I really got into this change of mindset thinking. We need to focus more on how decisions are made. So that's for me the big thing that I'm going to focus on now. There were two interesting really pieces of research that were published. One was called What Gets Measured Gets Done, and to this piece there was an interesting response piece titled What Gets Measured Doesn't Necessarily Get Done, saying how the risk for us researchers is to hide in our labs and do the kind of data analyses we find exciting, even though this might not translate into real-world improvements. I'm really interested in real-world improvements, so that's the thing where I'm taking this in how we can make change happen, or how we can facilitate and enable change to happen in a way that delivers against the needs of different people.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an amazing discussion. The PhD is non-walkability in a car-centric city. Dr. Tamara Bozovic, thank you so much for joining us. It's been awesome.
Kia ora, James.
Thanks for watching this episode from Season 3 of PhD Unpacked. For previous episodes from this season and Seasons 1 and 2, check us out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as other listening platforms. And follow us, PhD Unpacked, on Instagram and TikTok.